We want to welcome you to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. We want to say a very special welcome to Richard Lego and to H.I. Holland Prep. I believe H.I. Holland used to be Lisbon, and I attended Lisbon School, and my mother attended Lisbon School, and that building is at least 100 years old. Thank you for joining us. I hope you have a good lesson this morning on this cold winter but pretty day. Teachers, if you're watching, you have not signed up, please do so. Go to www.tiny.cc/3-5 registration. Sign up for us, please, so we'll have a record of your attendance. Program this morning is Ecosystems, Part 1. During this virtual field trip, students will observe the physical characteristics of environments and how they support populations and communities of plants and animals within an ecosystem. Students would also investigate the flow of energy in a food chain and predict how changes in the food chain affect the ecosystem. Mr. Monroe will tell you all about physical characteristics of environments, food chains by Ms. Ram, an owl pellet investigation by Ms. Ramirez, and Mr. Dominguez will tell you about changes in a food chain. Students, you cannot ask us a verbal question during this program, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/question-answer and fill out a question, send it to us, and we'll do our best to answer them during the program. If not, I'll send the answers to your teacher and they can discuss it with you. And now I am going to stop sharing my screen, and Mr. Monroe is going to tell you about the physical characteristics of environments. Sorry.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking at the characteristics of physical environment, the physical characteristics of environments. And a big word comes into play when we talk about that concept, and that is the word ecosystem. So to really help you understand what I'm going to be, the concepts that I'm going to be trying to teach you this morning, I have a short presentation that I'm going to present to you, and then I'm going to get out several examples of some animals that have actually come from different physical environments. Okay, so there's a couple of understandings that I'm hoping that you will get out of this presentation. First of all, how a forest ecosystem supports communities of plants and animals that are within that particular ecosystem. And then on the other hand, a different type of ecosystem like the pond, how it supports the community of plants and animals that inhabit it. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys and we'll get started. There's my helper. Let me know that he wants to have something to say. That's Smokey in the background. Now, there are some basic vocabulary words that I want you guys to understand, and these are some key vocabulary words. Ecosystem, biotic, abiotic, and abiotic factors. And I really wish you guys were here today with us because we could really get into it, except it's probably a little too cold for us to go out and interact with the two ecosystems that I would have you observe today. So I'll do my best to describe those, all right? So we're going to move on. You know, the biosphere is one of Earth's four systems, okay? Now, to understand where living things are, that is one vocabulary word that I want you guys to really remember. None of the Earth's systems are independent. Instead, they interdepend on each other. Now, independent means, you know, individually, being able to be dependent on themselves. But when we talk about the word interdependent, that means you're having to depend on something else within the system. There are four different systems on our planet. The lithosphere, which is the solid part of our planet, the hydrosphere, which is the water part of our planet, and then we have the atmosphere, which is the airspace or the air bubble around our planet. And then we have the biosphere. The biosphere is the portion of the Earth that supports living things. It's very unique here on Earth because our planet is abundant with living things. and they are dependent on the other systems. Living things in an ecosystem, such as plants and animals, fungi and microorganisms, we say that those are what we call biotic. So I want you guys to remember that, biotic. That is all the living things that live that are actually alive. On the other hand, all the non-living things in an ecosystem is the abiotic factors in the ecosystem include water, soil, temperature, air, wind, even the elevation. A source of energy, usually the sun, is also considered to be a non-living factor. Organisms are actually considered to be one living thing. As you see in this image, a mouse, that's an organism. If it's living and it's an individual thing, that's an organism. Example, a lion. Now, when we talk about a population is a group of organisms of the same species living together, such as these meerkats over here, or a pride of lions. That would be a group of lions. It is a population of one particular species, okay? Now, a community is a collection of interacting populations. Such in this image, you see lions and hyenas. That is a community, okay? Now, the ecosystem, organisms, and their physical surroundings. Now, in this instance, in this image over here, we see a deer, we see a frog, and then we also see some non-living parts, the physical surroundings, the water, the part of the sunlight. Those would be actually part of the ecosystem, but they would be the abiotic part. Now, this is the most important thing that I want you guys to understand. A habitat is the place where an organism lives out its life. Examples include the bottom of a stream, a maple tree, a pond, a park. A habitat can change due to natural and human causes. Natural would be such as maybe a flood would happen, or maybe there would be a fire. That would change that particular habitat. Now, human causes would be maybe development, people destroying the trees and just to make houses or build houses or residential areas. That would be a human cause. The biosphere systems are called ecosystems. All ecosystems must have a constant source of energy, usually the sun, because the sun is the ultimate source of energy on our planet, and cycles to reuse raw materials. For example, our water, nitrogen cycle, the oxygen and carbon dioxide cycle. An ecosystem is made up of all living and non-living components in that area. If you were here with us today, we might take a walk over in the Post Oak Preserve. That would represent our forest ecosystem. Or if we were studying the pond ecosystem, we would go down to the pond and explore that particular ecosystem, looking in and studying about the living that live there and the non-living. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll get into it a little bit further with the examples that I'm going to show you. Okay, I have a couple examples that come from different ecosystems, different physical environments. First of all, if we were walking in the woods today, we probably wouldn't see this species or this kind of animal. Now, remember what I said, an individual is an organism. So Teresa, the three-toed box turtle right here, she is an organism, okay? Now, all the box turtles that live in the Post Oak Preserve, that would be a population. And of course, they interact with a lot of the animals that are over there, okay? Especially if they're going to be feeding on some of them. Now, basically, Teresa, she's kind of like an omnivore. Most of the time, she eats leafy plants that are provided by that particular ecosystem. You see, certain foods certain places where these animals can live and be sheltered, and certain amount of space is needed. That's over there also. These are basic needs that organisms will find in their particular ecosystem or physical environment. And those physical environments support that particular organism living there. First of all, probably the most important is furnishing a habitat. And for an animal to have a habitat, there are certain things that need to be there: food, water, shelter, and even space. But I don't think we would see an animal of this species over there today because we are now in the season of winter. I know that Teresa has slowed down a little bit simply because if she was in the forest right now, she would be hibernating. And hopefully you guys know what hibernating means. She would be in a deep sleep. Yeah, she's kind of enjoying my warm hand. It's kind of cool in this room. Now I've got another animal that I will show you that comes from a different physical environment, an ecosystem, and that is Hoppy Jr., the bullfrog. This is Hoppy Jr. He is a bullfrog, and of course, if we went out to our pond ecosystem out here and we were looking around for Hoppy or an animal like Hoppy, then guess what? We probably wouldn't see him because, again, these guys like frogs that belong to the amphibian family or Teresa that belongs to a reptile family, they're cold-blooded. So they have to do what when it gets cold? The season of when it gets cold. They hibernate. So most likely if Hoppy was out there around the pond, we wouldn't find him. He'd be dug in somewhere in the ground and taking a deep sleep nap. When would he come back out? In the spring. But the physical environment that Teresa needs and the physical environment that he needs, totally different. This guy needs to be in and around water. Teresa, if she had to be in and around water, would not be good for her. She lives in a forest ecosystem. So the most important way that an ecosystem supports the organisms that live there that make up the community, guess what? There would be certain things there that they would have to have so that they could make that particular ecosystem their habitat. Now I'm going to put Hoppy Jr. up, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman. So if any of you have any questions, I bet he can answer those for you.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. Then we did have a question. What are the physical characteristics of an environment? An environment is the surroundings or conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives or operates. Physical characteristics are the natural features of the Earth's surface, such as landforms, drainage features, climates, soils, and vegetation. And thank you so much again, Mr. Monroe. And now Ms. Schramm is going to tell you about food chains.
Hey everybody, it's me, Miss Shram, and today we are talking all about food chains. So at the end of my part of the field trip, you'll be able to identify and describe the flow of energy in a food chain and predict how changes in the food chain affect the ecosystems. So here are our essential questions. What does a food chain show? And what is the role of the sun in a food chain? So we're going to start off with that second question. And what is the role of the sun? So the sun is what powers the entire food chain. So the sun powers the producers through photosynthesis. Those producers, which will be coming up next, are able to produce their own food because of the energy from the sun. So we get our light, our heat, everything from the sun. Without it, the rest of the food chain would not exist. And a fun fact about the sun is that it produces 4 million tons of energy every second. So here are our producers. So the producers create their own food through photosynthesis. So they are powered only by the sun, and they create their own food. They are autotrophs. So the producers include plants, lichens, moss, bacteria, and algae. All of these are essential for the existence of the entire ecosystem. Without them, our other animals would not be able to eat or exist at all. So let's see who comes next. Our primary consumers. So these are the first to eat, primary being first. So these are herbivores, so animals that consume only plant matter. This includes rabbits, caterpillars, cows, sheep, and deer. All of these animals only eat plants. So once again, those are herbivores. They are the first to eat the producers. Next, we have secondary consumers. So these include omnivores. So those are animals that eat plants and animals. These also include carnivores, animals that eat other animals. So like frogs, spiders, or snakes. So our examples of omnivores on this page are our chickens and our little birdies. So chickens a lot of times love to hunt for little bugs and critters in the grass. Our chickens here at the Environmental Center love mealworms. It's one of their favorite treats. But they also eat seeds and grains and grasses and other plants. And they love vegetables like pumpkin. They love fruits like watermelon, all sorts of crazy things. So they are omnivores. Then we have our tertiary consumers. So these are carnivorous predators that eat other animals. So maybe an owl, a shark, lion, an eagle, and even us humans. All right, so our next ones are decomposers. Now, the decomposers, they don't care where you are on the food chain. Eventually, when the organism dies, the decomposers will consume the dead animals and plant matter and return them to the soil. So decomposers work to break down anything and everything from the ecosystem and return it back to the soil to help new producers grow and start the food chain all over again. So this can include insects, fungi, and bacteria. So here is our example of a food chain. So a food chain shows a linear energy exchange. So I should have the sun here, but first we have our producer, and then our primary consumer, the grasshopper, then the secondary consumer, the frog, and the tertiary consumer, the owl, followed by our little earthworm decomposer. So there's our linear energy exchange. Now we know in real life that there isn't just a grasshopper, a frog, and an owl in an ecosystem. It's much more complicated. So another thing that you will learn about, not so much in this video, but other times in school, is food webs. So food webs show a more dynamic energy exchange within an ecosystem. So we have our same grass, our same grasshopper, our same frog, and our same owl. But what happens if along the way the grasshopper is eaten by a bird instead? Or if that frog was instead eaten by a snake? So food webs are more dynamic. It includes more animals in the ecosystem, and it gets a little more complicated. So it shows kind of more possibilities of energy exchanges. But for our purposes, the food chain is just fine because it helps us keep those roles really clear of who's primary, secondary, tertiary consumers. And it's just one example of something that would happen in a food chain. So my challenge to you is, can you create a food chain for a desert biome? So I have a cactus, a vulture, a mouse, a fennec fox, and a millipede. So could you arrange these in order to make a food chain? All right, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.
Hello, my name is Miss Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning all about owl pellets. So let me show you what an owl pellet looks like, and here's an example of one. I don't want to tell you exactly what it is yet, so go ahead and think about what do you think an owl pellet is. So here's an example of one. Let's see if you can make some observations about what you think this is. And I also have an owl friend. It's not a living owl. It's what we call a taxidermied owl. That means that this owl is a real owl. He's just sadly not alive anymore. So this is an example of a barn owl. And they get that name because they're most commonly found in a barn. But if you guys were here, you would be able to touch him and he feels super soft. Owls are very important birds of prey. That means they're excellent hunters because their feathers are so soft and light that a poor little mouse or other little animal won't even hear the owl coming because it has what's called silent flight. So they're very, very quiet animals. So I'm going to go ahead and put our little owl friend up and we'll start our presentation. So let me share my screen with you guys. I do have a couple of questions for you guys. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer these two questions. The first is, why do owls make owl pellets? And the second is, what do scientists use owl pellets for? Now, in this little video that you guys can see on the left, you'll see some examples of owls spitting up that owl pellet. So owl pellets are not poop. Instead, it is what an owl coughs back up or regurgitates. So regurgitate just means to cough it back up. So sort of think of like a cat and a hairball. Now, what's inside that owl pellet is simply the stuff that the owl's body cannot digest. So things like the fur and bones of an animal that it ate. So again, an owl pellet is not poop. It's just the coughed up remains of whatever the owl's body cannot digest. So let's take a quick look at how owl pellets form. Well, it first starts when the owl finds something to eat. So in this little example, we have the owl found a nice rat or mouse to eat. He ingests or eats the mouse. He eats it whole, so he's not going to be chewing it up with his food. Instead, there's muscle contractions that help to force the mouse down the owl's esophagus, which is like a throat. Eventually, the animal that it ate will end up in what's called the proventriculus. It's known as the first stomach, and it receives the food from the esophagus. After it travels through the proventriculus, it's going to go in another body part called the ventriculus. You guys might have heard of this also called a gizzard. Lots of other birds have gizzards too. So for example, chickens have gizzards, and gizzards are a very important organ for birds because remember, birds don't have teeth, so they can't chew their food. Instead, the gizzard is what helps to break down the food. So oftentimes birds will eat things like small pieces of sand or rock, and the job of the gizzard is to contract, meaning it squeezes the food and rubs the food against those rocks to help it break it down and crush it. You guys might even eat gizzards. I know places often sell like chicken gizzards to eat. I'm not a big fan of those, but that's what the gizzard is. It's just an organ in a bird. So once the food gets crushed inside the gizzard, all the stuff that the owl's body can use and digest will make its way through the rest of the digestive system, and all the other not good stuff like the bones and the fur will make its way back up the owl's esophagus and eventually be coughed back up in the form of a pellet. And it takes about 8 to 10 hours for that pellet to travel from the ventriculus all the way back up into the esophagus and spit back out again. So that's the owl pellet. And owl pellets are very important for scientists because oftentimes people are not going to see the actual owl, but they might find those owl pellets scattered around the forest. So here's an example of owl pellets for different species. So take a moment to compare and contrast the pellets from these various owl species. Notice the different sizes and shapes and the different food remains that can be found within each of those. And then also in this little graph here, take a look at how an owl pellet decomposes over time. So sometimes you might be lucky enough to find a fresh pellet outside and it's going to be really hard and cylindrical in shape. Over time though, just like everything else, it's going to start to decompose or break down into smaller pieces. And you can see how that owl pellet will break down and change over the course of months to even years. Now, I have not been lucky enough to find a fresh pellet, but I have found a pellet that's probably within a year, maybe 1 or 2 years old because it's already been broken down and I found most of the bones. I just couldn't find a lot of the fur left. So you can see how those pellets break down and decompose over time. Now, in our next little one, I have a little video for you guys, and it's going to be a dissection of an owl pellet. So let me get that video started. This is an owl pellet. Again, it's not poop. It's a regurgitated mass of hair and bones. And for Dallas ISD teachers, you can visit our DISD EEC website and order owl pellets for your class free of charge. Now, when you do your owl pellet dissection, it's going to come wrapped in some foil. All you do is just use your hands to remove the foil. I'm just going to use my hands to help me break open and investigate what's inside this pellet. But you can also use tweezers if you don't feel comfortable touching the owl pellet. I will say that the owl pellets have been sterilized in autoclave, so they're safe to touch. But as always, if you have concerns, again, just make sure you wash your hands after handling these. As I'm starting to break apart this owl pellet, I'm already starting to see some bones and other remains. I even found a skull. You can see those two long yellow teeth that probably came from a rodent skull. Two more skulls that were found. Again, the most common thing you're going to find in these pellets are probably going to belong to the rodents. This owl happened to find himself some nice small mice to eat. And I know that these are rodents because they have these long yellow teeth. And as you're continuing with your dissection of your owl pellet, just remember to pull apart as much of that hair as you can, because a lot of times smaller bone fragments are hidden in that fur. So you might find bone fragments from part of an arm or a leg. You might find some claws, a jawbone, or teeth. And there's a collection of bones that I found there. There's actually two jawbones. So there's one jawbone right here, and there's another jawbone further down. We also have parts of the legs that you can see, maybe a shoulder blade. Here's another rodent skull. You can see the eye socket, the little tiny teeth here, and then the long front teeth or incisors. Again, here's a better close-up of the rodent skull. Now, my challenge for you guys is to see if you can identify these bones. Feel free to pause the video to allow more time to make observations. You might have to do some online research, either using owl pellet dichotomous keys or search for owl pellet bone identification charts. You can even use the one that I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation to see if you can match up some of these bones. Oops, let me get over to our next slide. Let me see if it'll let me go. So just an overall review of where owls fit in a food chain. So we know that a food chain shows the path of energy from one living thing to another. And the source of all energy within a food chain is the sun. So the sun is very important. The sun provides energy to plants, and we know that the science word for plants is producers. That's super easy to remember because producers and plants start with the same letter P. So producers are just things that can make their own food, for example, plants or trees. Then we have consumers. Consumers are animals. They cannot make their own food. Instead, they have to eat other things for food. You guys are all consumers. Y'all have to consume or eat other things. So we have all of our consumers here, and then we have our owl. So an owl is a high-level consumer, meaning that it is a predator. So owls will eat things like mice, rats, smaller birds, and even some snakes. Owls are carnivores, meaning they are meat eaters. So my thinking question for y'all is to think about, where would decomposers fit in a food chain? And this is my last slide. So just to review, scientists study owl pellets because they provide very important information. Those pellets can help identify owl species in an area. So even though we might not see the owl, if we see the owl pellet, scientists can help use that to help identify what's in the area. Those pellets also tell us about what the owl's been eating, and pellets can tell us about the diversity of prey that are available in an area. And if scientists happen to notice that the owl pellets are changing, that might be a good indication that something is going on within an environment. Now, remember I said that teachers can order owl pellets for free if they're in DISD. A lot of the common things that you're going to find within those owl pellets are mostly going to be rodents, but sometimes you might be super lucky to find the remains of a shrew, which is this cute little guy here. You might even find a mole, which is this other cute little animal here. And sometimes you might be lucky to find the remains of birds. So that's all I have for you guys today on owl pellets. We're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. And she just answered part of this question. Where can we get owl pellets? Mr. Ramirez told you that if you're part of the DISD, you can get them from the Science Resource Center or the Living Materials Center. And if you're not, Carolina Biological or Ward's Science Supply, you can order them from them. All right, and now Mr. Dominguez is going to tell you about changes in a food chain.
Hey guys, it's Mr. Dominguez, and I'm outside on a very cold and cloudy day here at the EEC. And today we are going to discuss changes to food chains. We are primarily going to focus on the effects of removing producers from a food chain. So, what are producers? Producers are organisms that create their own food. So, think of plants and photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which plants create their own food using sunlight, nutrients found in soil, and water. So if we removed all of these trees, all of these grasses and plants, what would happen to the organisms that we see around us? What would happen to you? What would happen to those pigs in the background? What would happen to these cows? So today we are going to discuss the effects of removing producers from a food chain. So let's get started. All right, guys, so first let's review what a food chain is. And you can think of a food chain as the transfer of energy from one organism to another. And of course, this energy comes in the form of food. So let's see, we're going to start off with the producer, right? The producer are these acorns. These acorns come from a tree, and we have plenty of acorns here at the post oak. And those acorns are eaten by the mouse, and we have plenty of those here at the center as well. And that mouse is eaten by the snake, and the snake is eaten by the hawk. And when food chains intertwine in an ecosystem, they create food webs.
So, a really good way of understanding what would happen if we lost a producer in a food chain is by looking at our own diet. So, here I have a sandwich. I love sandwiches, and it's a very common meal for a lot of us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove anything that exists because of a producer or is a producer itself. So remember, producers are plants, those autotrophs. Autotrophs are organisms that can produce their own food and don't rely on consuming other organisms for sustenance. So think of plants, right? Plants use photosynthesis to produce their own food. They don't go hunting any other organisms for food. So let's start off with my bread. If my producers were gone, I wouldn't have bread because bread is made out of wheat, right? So wheat is a plant. It's gone. So lettuce, a plant, is gone, right? So I am removing anything that is a producer or is in existence because of a producer. So tomato is the fruit of the tomato plant. So that is gone. Onions are lovely, and I love onions, but these would be gone because they are producers. Now you may be wondering, well, at least I have my roast beef or ham or whatever you like. I like roast beef. Well, what do cows eat? Cows are herbivores, so they eat nothing but plants. So without plants, or if a plant were to be removed from a food chain that had cows in it, well, those cows would be gone. So I'm sorry, no more cows, no more roast beef. Now, if we don't have cows, we would, of course, not have this. What is this? Cheese, right? So that cheese is gone. And my final piece of bread, well, we already said that without plants we wouldn't have bread, so that's gone. So my entire sandwich is gone. And that's because I removed producers from a food chain. So without those producers, us consumers would not be around. So we are heavily reliant on those producers.
Now, what would happen if a consumer were removed from a food chain? Well, it would have very similar effects. Take the honeybee, for example. The honeybee helps plants reproduce through pollination. This is a symbiotic relationship that these two organisms share. They both benefit from this relationship, and removing the honeybee or the plant would have detrimental effects on both organisms. So the flower gets the benefit of being pollinated and being able to pass on its genes and reproduce, and the honeybee is able to gather nectar to provide for its colony. It's pretty amazing to think that the energy generated by the sun is eventually passed down to us through a food chain. So plants create their own food using photosynthesis. Plants are eaten by other animals, and those animals are consumed by other animals higher in the food chain. And some of them may eventually get to us as a food source. So that energy gets passed down to all of these organisms, and removing any animal, any organism from a food chain may have detrimental effects to the entire food chain. So let's make sure that we maintain and preserve those food chains as they are. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this part of your virtual field trip. Hopefully I get to see you guys next time in person. Have a great day.
Thank you, Mr. Dominguez. Question, what causes a change in a food web? One major cause of disruptions in the food chain may be global warming. Many species are quite sensitive to changes in their natural living conditions. If air or water temperature increases, these species may decrease in numbers. And now I'm going to share my screen. During this virtual field trip, students observe the physical characteristics of environments and how they support populations and communities of plants and animals within an ecosystem. Students also investigate the flow of energy in the food chain and predict how changes in the food chain affect the ecosystem. Mr. Monroe told you about physical characteristics of environments. Ms. Ram covered food chains. Ms. Ramirez did a demonstration on owl pellet investigations, and Mr. Dominguez changes in a food chain. Thank you, teacher, for joining us. We would certainly appreciate it if you'd go to www.tiny.cc/3-5 feedback and fill out a short form and send it to us. We would appreciate that. You guys have a great rest of the day, and be sure and wear your coat.